Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are taking a look at passives, how they work and how you can use them to improve your game. And more specifically, I'll be looking at what I call the big three. And the reason I call them the big three is because I've seen a lot of people talk about them, and generally people seem very confused about what these stats are supposed to be used for. But all of that ends today because I'm gonna explain to you how to use them and how they will make your game much, much better. Or at least I think it'll make your game much better. But first, let's take a look at the book and see what it says about them. Right here. A passive check is a special kind of ability check that doesn't involve any die rolls. Such a check can represent the average result for a task done repeatedly, such as searching for secret doors over and over again, or can be used when the DM wants to secretly determine whether a character succeeds at something without rolling dice, such as noticing a hidden monster. That's what the book says about passives, but how does that translate to your game? Well, for the first part, let's take a look at the following situation. The party is making their way through a dungeon and they reach a locked door, for example. You have your rogue try to unlock the door. Now, for the purposes of this scenario, we're gonna take the rogue as having the following stats: plus 3 proficiency bonus, expertise with thieves' tools, and plus 3 to the relevant stat modifier, for a total bonus of 9. Now, let's say your log's DC is 15. So your rogue rolls and they roll 3. So now the row is 12. And instead of having them reroll and wasting everybody's time, especially if it's one of those nights where the player can't seem to roll more than 2, you can instead just use their passive. The way you figure out their passive is you take their ability bonus to the relevant ability, in this case it's plus 9, and add 10 to it. And that's the passive, which is higher than the log DC. So now, after they fail their first row, you can just subtract some time from the in game time and allow them to succeed even with a failed row. And the way this could work in game is with a description such as you attempt to pick the lock, something that's very easy for you, and this particular type of lock is one you've picked many times before, you suddenly find your way struggling. And instead of the normal 10 to 15 seconds it would take you, it now takes you, for example, 2 minutes or a minute, depending on what the DM determines is appropriate in the situation. Personally, I would add about 10 to 15 seconds per every one that they're below the DC with the roll. So I would add about 45 seconds to a minute to their attempt. And if I would determine that it would take them about 10 to 15 seconds to unlock it normally, that means about a minute. So I would personally tell the player that it takes them a minute instead of 10 seconds to unlock the door. And while that doesn't seem very major, it does two things. Number one, it saves everybody's time because now this rogue isn't just rolling over and over again and failing. Because, like I said, it's one of those nights. Everyone's had them. I've had them. It is not fun for anyone. I mean, it's funny the first few seconds, but then it just gets really old really fast. So, anyway, the second thing this does is in a tense situation where they can't really afford to waste time, like for example, let's say in this situation, instead of crawling through a dungeon, the party is organizing a distraction for a guard or a noble, and the rogue has to quickly pick a lock and steal something and then make it look like nothing's been touched. Well, now if they fail, it'll take them some extra time to unlock it, and that could cause a whole new situation. They might need an alternative way to escape, one that they didn't plan for previously. They might have planned for a possible failure, but most parties I've played with don't. And so having a situation like this occur out of the blue typically would cause some pretty interesting things to happen. And all of that happens without wasting any time. And the best part about passives is that you can apply this to any ability check. You can apply it, for example, for performance for a bard that wants to play in a tavern. Because if it's something they would play routinely, like a melody or a tune they're really good with. Instead of having the player roll and potentially fail at something that they should be so used to doing, it's basically second nature, you can just use their passive and only make them roll if they're really trying to impress. Because when you're trying to impress, you're stepping out of your routine, and that's when a roll becomes more relevant. At least in my opinion. Of course, you're welcome to roll for everything all the time if you want, but I personally think this is a much better way to do it, and it speeds up the game significantly. But all of those aside, let's focus on the big three. Now, what are the big three? They're your passive perception, passive investigation, and passive insight. Now, the game designers thought these stats were so important that they have their own section on the character stat sheets and even in monster stat blocks. And this is for good reason. Uh, Now, for this, I'm gonna skip the description for the relevant ability checks because while the description explains very well what the ability check is for, it doesn't very well represent what the passive is for, so I'm going to explain the passives in my own words instead. Starting with passive perception. Passive perception represents how your character experiences the world through their senses, i.e., how they see the world, how well they hear, what they smell, how they feel temperature, what they feel when they touch a surface. And all of this, the higher your passive perception is, the more, let's say, detailed information you get. So, a character with a high passive perception versus a character with an average passive perception, average being 10. Yes, 10 is average. That means that a character with 10 passive perception would notice everything you and I would notice in a situation, assuming we have an average passive perception. So, a character with high passive perception is more likely to notice things that are harder to spot when they're looking at something, or to hear faint sounds when they're listening to something, to smell weak odors in the air when they're breathing, to taste something off in food when they're eating, to notice subtle temperature changes in the room when they're entering it or while they're staying in it. And all of these can be used to alert the party to things that aren't normally gonna be noticed by the average person, such as, for example, a sudden temperature change could alert the party, for example, if they're in a haunted house, that a specter might be in the room, because this is a pretty popular thing among ghost hunters in our world, that the temperature might drop if an entity is there. Or, if you want, the temperature could rise if it's a particular type of entity that's related somehow to fire or heat. Additionally, there could be a faint melody or a really faint sound that somebody with high passive perception can hear, like knocking or screaming, and this way the party could find a lost NPC that's locked somewhere in a hidden area of a house. Another sense you could use is, for example, smell. The high passive perception character could smell that something's in the air and alert the others that, for example, somebody's trying to knock them out with gas. Same with taste. If they eat something and it tastes off, they could determine, maybe with a medicine check or maybe just because they're familiar with poisons, they could determine that somebody's food is poisoned. And typically, the way I would determine if they succeed or fail in this would be, for example, for the gas, I would take a look at the DC for the gas to knock somebody out. And if their passive perception is higher than the DC, they would notice the gas unless it's odorless. And same for the poison. If they taste the food before they swallow it, the moment it hits their tongue, I would take a look at the DC for the poison, and if they have a higher passive perception than the DC, they would notice that it tastes off again unless the poison is tasteless, which not a lot of poisons are, and it's a really cool way to reward a player for having high passive perception. But passive perception has another, more concrete purpose, and that's to be used as the DC to hide from you. And that's the passive perception for both players and monsters. So if a monster's trying to hide from the party, it has to roll a stealth check versus the highest passive perception in the party. And at the same time, if a player wants to hide from a monster, they have to beat the highest passive perception in the monster group. Provided that there is somewhere to hide, of course. You can't hide in the middle of a plane, obviously, unless you're invisible or otherwise obscured. Moving on to passive investigation. Passive investigation is your character's ability to notice details in their environment. That's details that they can spot with their passive perception, but they would more easily notice if something's off that others wouldn't. So I assume you've watched at least one super detective movie in your life, and you notice how when the super detective character enters a room, they look around and see what everyone else is seeing, but now suddenly they start to put together clues. The For example, the blood splatters are off. They're not what they should be based on the scenario that's described, or this cabinet doesn't look right, or this there's scratches on the floor over here which don't make sense based on the scenario. This is something that everybody sees, but only the high passive investigation character actually acknowledges as being clues. Additionally, passive investigation is how well the character puts clues together when, for example, you drop the party breadcrumbs to follow for something. The other players might not necessarily figure out what exactly the clues mean, and that's when the passive investigation comes in. You grab the highest passive investigation, and when you feel they have enough clues, you can just tell the players directly. So this character has enough passive investigation to figure out the clues. I can give you the answer, or you can brainstorm it if you want to continue. This way, the players get to choose whether they want to just move on or whether they want to figure something out. And this is important to have because I've personally found myself in a situation where the DM gave us a puzzle, which was an interesting enough puzzle, but unfortunately it was a new DM. And so they explained the puzzle kind of poorly, and they gave the clues in a very convoluted way, which while we at the end finally managed to solve the riddle that he gave us, it took way longer than anyone would have liked. Way longer. And using passive investigation in this way would have saved us probably an hour, maybe two. Yeah, I'm talking that long. Do yourselves a favor and actually try passive investigation. It's great. But again, the more concrete use for passive investigation in your game is to spot ambushes. That's right, you don't use perception to spot ambushes because there's usually nothing to perceive. Mind you, there's a little bit of a caveat here. You can use perception to spot an ambush, but that only works if there's something to perceive. So, if you have a bunch of smelly goblins hiding, a really high passive perception character might smell them. But just because they're smelling something that smells bad doesn't necessarily mean they'll figure out it's an ambush. Whereas a character with high passive investigation will notice that there's something off about the environment. Like, for example, the road seems to have been swept ahead as if to cover tracks, or some of the branches and bushes seem to be broken off. And that could alert them that, hey, somebody might be hiding in these bushes. And the way to determine if the character with the high passive investigation notices that there's an ambush ahead is simple. You have your group of monsters roll a group stealth check. The way you roll a group stealth check or a group check in general is you take the highest bonus for that check in the entire group and you roll with that bonus with advantage because the whole group is working together. And then that becomes the DC, or rather, that is versus the DC that in this case is the passive investigation. So if the group of monsters roll collectively higher than the highest passive investigation on your party, they will hide successfully and ambush the players. But if they don't, they won't hide as successfully, and the character with the high passive investigation will spot that something's off, and because they have a high passive investigation, they'll figure out that there's probably an ambush up ahead. Lastly, we have passive insight. Passive insight is the character's ability to read the room, so to speak, and to read others. So the way passive insight works is it itself is the DC for this character to be lied to be persuaded, intimidated, or even to be impressed by somebody's performance. So every time a character or NPC rolls for any of the charisma based abilities, they roll versus passive insight. So if they're trying to impress somebody with their amazing music playing skills, they would roll a performance check versus the passive insight of whoever's looking at them. And if they beat the passive insight, they get to impress that NPC. Same goes with persuasion. If they're trying to convince the NPC to do something, they roll versus the passive insight. If they're trying to lie to the NPC, again versus passive insight. Same with intimidation. If the character is trying to intimidate somebody, they roll versus passive insight. And the NPC can tell if the character is just a blowhard or if they actually have backing behind them. Thus, even a relatively low intimidation check versus a high insight NPC could still intimidate them because they might realize that even though this guy isn't very good at intimidating speeches, they have a party of really impressive cutthroats with them, and maybe this NPC isn't silly enough to try their luck. So these are things to consider. And now, why should you use these versus just letting the players throw perception for everything? Because that seems to be the norm. Just anything that needs to be seen, roll perception, or versus having them roll insight to mind read the NPCs. Well, I just gave you the answer. Perception isn't the only useful stat in the game, and it is, in my opinion, extremely overrated because, for the sake of simplicity, I guess, everybody's just rolling perception for quite literally everything, and that's, while it's not wrong, it's not optimal. It makes stats like intelligence kind of take a back seat even though they shouldn't be, and it makes passive investigation feel like this thing that nobody really knows why it's there. It's just kind of there. When in reality, it's actually a really good stat to have high, and the higher you have your passive investigation, the easier your life in general is gonna be, as it should be, in my opinion. That's kind of how it is in the real world. If you're really smart, even though your life might not be as easy, you have the potential to make it easier. And that's high passive investigation for you. And why not roll insight checks? Well, that I'm sure a lot of you who've seen any amount of content on the internet about D&D, you already know the answer to that one. When you have players roll insight, and actually it's the same for having them roll perception. If you have them roll perception, even if they fail, you alert them that something's happening. And if you have them roll insight, they can see the roll and they can see that it's not very high if it's not very high. And then thus they know it's not reliable because it's not a high roll. That's kind of the norm. You roll low, you know that your roll isn't reliable. At the same time, if they high roll and you tell them that they don't feel something's off, they know nothing's off because why would they know otherwise? They rolled really high. And most players are wise to the fact that a lot of DMs don't bother setting DCs for anything. They just look at the roll and figure, yeah, that's high enough, I'll just let them have it. Or, yeah, that's not high enough, I won't let them have it. Everybody does this, everyone's wise to it, it's not new. But it's also not good because, as I just said, it essentially turns insight checks into mind reading, and that's not the point. And so, to fix this, some people have implemented a house rule where the DM rolls perception checks and insight checks behind the DM screen, which, although is a type of fix, it doesn't fix the arbitrary DCs where it's not even DCs, it's just look at the roll, is it high enough? Oh, great. It's not high enough? Well, too bad. Also, when the players can't see the rolls, the DM can kind of just decide. They can just decide to fudge rolls, and it just takes away all of the player agency. It becomes the DM playing with themselves, at least in my opinion, and I don't like it. I don't think it's a good way to solve this. And passives are a much better way to solve it, even though you might look at the explanation I gave so far and think, How does that not take away player agency? And I'll explain. You see, when it comes to passives, especially what I call the big three, the players have a lot more control over them than you might think. Because just by choosing how their characters behave, the players can alter these stats in real time. How does that work? Well, you see, there are three states your character can be in. One is aware, which is your normal state, where you use your normal value for passive perception, investigation, and insight. One is distracted, where your passives are -5, and one is alert, where your passives are +5. And the difference between these is quite literally how you describe your character's behavior. So if you tell your DM that your character is walking slowly through the cavern, for example, and looking around carefully, they are now on alert and they have +5 to their passive perception and investigation. And at the same time, if you tell your DM that your character is watching the NPC closely, you're now again on alert. You get a +5 to your passive insight, so it's harder to lie to you. And the same goes for if you describe your character as just brazenly walking as fast as they can, they aren't paying attention to their surroundings. Now your character is distracted. And if you're talking to an NPC and your character is doing something else in the meantime or isn't paying attention, they're now distracted and they have -5 to their passive insight. And so, why does this matter? First, it allows characters that haven't invested in the perception, investigation, and insight skills, they aren't proficient, it still allows them to spot more than the normal person would. On top of that, specifically when talking about insight, having these three states play a factor in how the characters interact with NPCs actually makes interactions, social interactions, a lot more intricate than you might think. Because, as I mentioned earlier, when an NPC is trying to lie to the characters, it's versus passive insight. But it's also the case when an NPC is trying to convince the characters of something via a persuasion check. So, somebody watching an NPC really closely might not be convinced by a persuasion check. And let's take a look at the following scenario. An NPC walks up to the party and introduces themselves and then claims to be an ally of a friend of the party and says that they're here to give them something or tell them something or because they need some kind of help or anything really. But the party doesn't believe that NPC initially and is ready to attack them. Now, you, as the DM, would roll persuasion behind the DM screen and then tell every player who has a higher passive insight than the role that they find this NPC suspicious. And the reason they find the NPC suspicious is because if you've ever talked to somebody that's trying to convince you of something, even if they're not lying to you, there's always, you always look at them and it feels like they're trying a little bit too hard to convince you. That's just, at least in my experience, that's kind of how humans work. And so by applying this to your game, suddenly you realize that their insight has become intuition because it's up to the players to figure out if that roll you just made was for deception or for persuasion. And at the end of the day, even if they feel something's off, they can take a look at the NPC's general demeanor and the way they speak and how much information they have about their friend or about them and try to determine that way whether or not they're lying. And I think that's a lot more interesting. And as you probably guessed already, this also means that in some situations, the party could determine somebody's lying when they were actually just trying to convince them of something. And I think that brings insight checks back to where they should be. I think also using passives saves a lot of work for the DM because now you don't have to arbitrarily figure out DCs for things. You can just look at a stat block provided you have one. And most importantly, now in these scenarios, all of the NPC abilities matter because if you take a look at the stat block, you see that they have skills like persuasion. There are a lot of NPCs that have a persuasion proficiency. Some have expertise, some of them have it in deception, in intimidation. But in my experience, those are never used, and the reason is because passives are never used. Why would you use the NPC's persuasion if you don't really know what you're using it versus? And that's kind of sad. It's a lot of really cool things that work really well that are just not used because people don't understand them. And I hope this video helped you understand passives better. I hope it helped you understand the big three better. And I hope you enjoyed watching it. And if you did, hit like. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe and hit the notifications bell if you don't want to miss anything that I come up with next. Also, if you have any questions or you want me to talk about a specific topic, you can leave me a comment about it. And what did you think of the video? Tell me in the comments also. I love to hear from you. Anyway, I'm done here. I hope you learned something, and if you want me to explain passives in more detail or give more examples or make a specific video where I talk extensively about specific passives, let me know. I'll be happy to do it. I enjoy doing this, and have a good day.